Here's a true confession from a practicing historian. I spend way more time than I should thinking about what my colleagues in the future are going to say about the history of right now. I spend a lot of time thinking about what is that chapter in the textbook going to look like, where it explains leadership in the 2010s. And I get this kind of fever dream combination of presidents past and present and some members of Congress and a few pop stars and then some social movement leaders. And then I start calculating my years till retirement to see if I'm going to actually be out of here by the time it's my job to make that make sense to anybody. Now, it was in one of these modes not too long ago that I tweeted the question, what is the first thing that comes to mind when you hear the words American leadership? And I got mostly crickets, but 5 answers. 3 were some variation on it's a thing of the past. 1, wealth. The other was a lovely constellation of qualities and contradictions that seemed to express more frustration than exhilaration. Now, I'd taken my data set, all of the probably dozens of people who saw the tweet, but they didn't respond because the question didn't move them, they drew a blank when they thought of American leadership, or they felt uncomfortable talking about it for some reason or another. This led me to believe that our current politics, our high-velocity politics of disruption, has lent a lot of energy to our political conversation, and it has sapped our political imagination. That was a sad thing to think about. But as I sat there with that, I did what historians are wont to do and start sort of rifling through the past, and suddenly came to mind one person, this image of this person. An Omaha area Irish Catholic priest with a steadfast concern for child welfare, weak lungs, here holding the Oscar statuette that was awarded to Spencer Tracy for portraying this man in the film Boys Town in 1938. I am talking about the one and only Father Edward J. Flanagan, who I got to know well, writing part of his biography for his cause for canonization as a saint in the Catholic Church. Now, you may know him perhaps as the person who revolutionized child welfare in the United States by convincing people that there are no bad boys, as he would say, but rather a world of adults who failed to provide children with the love and the guidance that they need and deserve. Or maybe you know him as the person who didn't build an institution, but a home for every boy who lived there. You may have seen the famous statue with an older boy carrying a younger one on his shoulders, and the inscription says, "He ain't heavy, he's my brother," regardless of his race, creed, or religion. You might know him as President Truman's envoy to Germany and Japan in 1945 to develop orphanages for the many children in the former Axis nations who no longer had parents to love and to guide them after the war. And I'm not going to talk to you about even one of those things. I'm not even going to talk to you about child welfare. I'm going to take you off-roading into the land of so-called extraneous historical detail. Why? Because history does 2 things. 1, it makes the past visible. It illuminates the past. But it also, at the same time, obscures it. The idea here is one that historical sociologist Eviatar Zerababel has called our norms of historical focusing. It's our system for determining what parts of the past become history and what shape that history takes. Because the past is absolutely everything that happens, which is more than our little human minds can even begin to contain or process, let alone make meaning of. So history is the edited and condensed and sorted out version of the past that we adapt and adopt to make mind-sized and informative. To get a sense of what I'm talking about, let me show you the painting Parson Weems' Fable, which anyone who's ever taken a class from me, almost ever in all of my career, has seen at one point or another. So here it is again, students. If I ask my students to tell me what this painting is about, they will tell me it's George Washington, the cherry tree, and truth as a foundational American virtue. And that makes very good sense, because our norms of historical focusing tell us to attend to what is largest, what is in the front, what is most familiar, and where symbols of power are concentrated. And certainly we get the familiar because we've got George Washington's $1 head stuck on his like 5-year-old body for whatever reason. Now, I'm not arguing here for dispensing with our conventional means of organizing the past, because truthfully, I don't know where I would be professionally or even personally if I didn't have these great things like chronologies to measure change over time, or decades to contain a bunch of years in, or wars so that we have common markers, right, to kind of relate to. But what I am saying is that by accepting these organizing structures as natural and beyond question, we lose sight of the fact that years that end in 2 or prolonged periods of peace are also consequential. They're just off the narrative beat, often with low and slow indirect impacts. So behind these structures of history is an entire past available to us and hiding in plain sight. Because if I were to ask you to look at Parson Weems again, and this time don't focus on George Washington, focus on the people in the very back, harvesting the cherries from the tree that hasn't been cut. Now we have a past that is a very different narrative about race, invisibility, and the historical construction of American virtue. So there's more past, there's more story to tell than meets the eye. And when we shift our focus, we find things like this. In 1942, President Franklin Roosevelt publicly congratulated Father Flanagan for 25 years of constructive service to American citizenship. It is also the year that Franklin Roosevelt authorized the mass incarceration of 120,000 Americans of Japanese descent from the West Coast, without any evidence of espionage or sabotage. Now, this was not the biggest story in Nebraska. Nebraska did not have an evacuation. There wasn't even a very large Japanese-American population. But this initiative was not without its effects. An Episcopal minister was arrested from the front steps of his church after giving a Sunday sermon and held in detention without charges for 2 years for the very fact of being a Japanese-American man. The state of Nebraska refused a request from the federal government to build a camp in the state. The governor was very clear: the people of Nebraska will not take members of this so-called enemy race within its borders unless they could get in on the work program that actually would release a few prisoners to help bring in the harvest. Now, Nebraska also had these kinds of ambivalent feelings from time to time about Boys Town. It was a beloved place, but there were people who said that there were just junior criminals out there, and requested that Father Flanagan build a fence and contain those boys in their place. To which Father Flanagan always replied, "I am not building a prison, I'm building a home. You do not wall in members of your family." Which means that, if you think about it, in 1942, Franklin Roosevelt was building structures of segregation, and Father Flanagan had built one of the first integrated communities in the United States. Meanwhile, back in one of those incarceration camps, 2 Japanese-American men wrote to Father Flanagan and asked if he might sponsor them to come to Boys Town to live and to work for the duration of the war under Father Flanagan's supervision rather than the federal government's. Now, Father Flanagan, if nothing else, was a practical person. And if you were running a village of boys, at least I know if I were, I would take all the help I could get. So he not only wrote for these 2 men to come to Boys Town to teach the boys how to do agricultural work, he negotiated the release of 10 Japanese-American families to come to Boys Town. And these adults were supervised within a city of children, but they could live there as members of communities and not as prisoners. Among the 200 people that Father Flanagan brought to Omaha, or to Boys Town, was Patrick Okura. This in spite of enormous national controversy that came to Father Flanagan and to Boys Town. Right? All of this not in the standard Father Flanagan story. Here's what happened. In 1939, this man, Patrick Okura, was the highest-ranking Japanese-American civil servant for the city of Los Angeles, and he was enormously successful. In 2 years, he got 2 promotions. He brought in a lot of talented Japanese-American civil servants because he helped people break their stereotypes and that excluded them. And his Caucasian co-workers liked him so much that they jokingly referred to him as their Irish friend, Patrick Okura, which was really lovely and sweet until the syndicated columnist Drew Pearson took that fact and twisted it into fake news and reported that the Empire of Japan had an agent in the Los Angeles city government posing as an Irishman who was going to bring down the water and the electrical grid. The mayor of Los Angeles, of course, had to kind of perform this outrage. He demanded that Okura resign not once but twice, and Patrick Okura refused to resign his job not once but twice. So the city of Los Angeles granted Patrick Okura a leave of absence so he would be on time for his new life in incarceration at the Santa Anita racetrack. A horse had been living there just prior to he and his wife Lily. The mayor of Los Angeles was incensed that Father Flanagan would bring Okura to Boys Town and testified before a congressional committee on un-American propaganda activities that Father Flanagan had brought the most dangerous Japanese where he could influence the philosophy of citizens of the future. The FBI came out and said that the charges against Patrick Okura were completely false, and Father Flanagan still continued to get letters of condemnation from the public, which he answered 201. I don't think that we should be a party to condemning people until they are proven guilty, and I am sure that this is your attitude also. Bloop. He didn't say bloop. Although if he had emojis, I don't know. The Okuras, for their part, didn't listen to the noise. They started a reception committee to help other Japanese-American families settle into Boys Town because they had never been to Omaha, Nebraska, and they had just been through a civil rights atrocity. Their reception committee, though, was so successful that it became a model for the federal government, which means that the Okura's jailers came back to them and said, now help us lead the way in entering these camps. Because, by the way, it wasn't too long before the camps were filled that they were an Axis propaganda gift and unconstitutional. The Okuras helped with this, and in 1947, when everyone was resettled, they reconstituted to found the Omaha chapter of the Japanese American Citizens League, which is the oldest and largest Asian civil rights organization in the United States. After 17 years at Boys Town, Patrick Okura went to the National Institutes of Health, where he innovated specialized health care to meet the needs of underserved and underrepresented minority communities. In 1962, based on that national profile, Patrick Okura was elected the national president of the Japanese American Citizens League, which made him a major civil rights leader. And as such, he was invited to stand on the dais with Dr. Martin Luther King in 1963 when he delivered his I Have a Dream speech. Patrick Okura, a sort of little-known civil rights leader, continued the struggle for civil rights for everyone all the way through the 1980s, when he got his $20,000 check, which most people did, to make up for having been wrongly incarcerated, and used that $20,000 to found the Okura Mental Health Leadership Foundation to train mental health specialists in Asian American communities, continuing Dr. King's effort and Father Flanagan's and his own to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last. Now, our offbeat history, our trip off-roading into history, reveals 4 things. And this is for you, and this is for my friends in the Twitterverse who didn't know what to do with that question about American leadership. It shows us that leaders don't have to have followers. And if they do, they don't have to focus on who's following them. Because what they need to lead are a set of values that they believe in and that they don't stray from. They live them, they show them, they share them. They don't care what anyone does in response to them, and they invite people along. In fact, leaders need that consistent value system far more than they need affiliations and sort of these steadfast allegiances to established political ideologies. Leaders don't have to disrupt and destroy to start a revolution. Father Flanagan did not change one thing about what he was doing at Boys Town to make Boys Town this center for civil rights, a sort of incubator for civil rights activity. He just kept doing the same thing according to his values and made the sensible decision to bring the Japanese Americans to Boys Town and to defend the innocent. Finally, we can redefine success for our leaders in terms of what we know is possible from what we can see in the past. So by thinking about this, maybe we can ask our leaders, we can measure their success about how much space they create for the next leader to rise, to go beyond where they can go, or to lead into places that they cannot. Maybe what we are looking for are leaders who can stick to values and grow and build and not bludgeon one another with ideological positions to get the big win and catch all of us in the crossfire. So I'm calling on you to look into the past at what may be hidden behind these frameworks that we usually use to make history visible and useful. That's what I'll be doing, and that's what I'm going to do when I'm called upon to put this era in perspective for my students of the future. Thank you.